This is a video series on the real-life geography and culture inspired by A Song of Ice and Fire, Game of Thrones, and yes, House of the Dragon. In my previous video, we covered Westeros, the continent where most of the action of the book series and certainly House of the Dragon happens in. However, in this video, we're going to go over the continent of Essos and some other parts of the world to see how much inspiration from our real world went into George R.R. Martin's world. While the majority of Game of Thrones happens in the continent of Essos, almost all of the House of the Dragon happens in Westeros. However, there is another continent that plays a pivotal role in world building, and that is Essos. I'm assuming it's called Essos because it starts with an E and East also starts with an E, but I really don't know for sure. Anyway, Essos is horizontally oriented. It stretches across a vast distance to the point of unknown, in the same way that many Europeans during the Middle Ages may have heard whispers about the existence of, say, China, but most of them knew almost nothing about China. And so the further away we get away from Europe, the more lands we're talking about that are shrouded in mystery. And we see this in George R.R. Martin's fictional world as well, as it's from the standpoint of the Westerosi. The further you go away from Westeros, the more fantastical and even mythological elements play into what we supposedly know about it. The more, dare I say, bullshit plays into the story. So a lot of this is conjecture about conjecture, so just keep that in mind. Another factor is that because most of the story happens in Westeros, there isn't just as much attention paid to Essos, and as a result, a lot of these other parts of the world are less fleshed out. And again, more conducive to tall tales, just like we saw in the real world before the Age of Exploration. So take some of this with a grain of salt. Many have argued that the continent of Essos is somewhat analogous to Asia, not necessarily East Asia, but really the giant continent of Asia. For better or for worse, many Europeans once saw themselves as Occidental in distinction from the Oriental, which meant the East. However, the East is not a monolith. Obviously, people in the Middle East today who practice Islam are very different than the Han Chinese people in, well, China. And the same is true for Essos. Generally speaking, the least eastern parts of Essos are those held by a series of states called the Free Cities, which are city-states. These again are independent, they are not part of a greater kingdom, and by and large could be seen as somewhat analogous to the various city-states that existed across much of the Mediterranean throughout human history. The reason why they're called the Free Cities is because they were once part of an empire, at least for the most part, but no longer are. They are now independent city-states as stated before. After all, given a period of time where you didn't have cars or planes, power probably would have to be more localized, and cities being the most densely populated areas would have the most power projection. But then again, it would by and large be a local affair, not some sort of empire that could span an entire continent. I would argue that the world building you see in Essos is more conducive to what you'd expect from the Middle Ages and by and large more realistic than the continent-wide state that you see in the Seven Kingdoms in Westeros. Nearly all of these free cities reside on the coast or along a river, as humans tend to settle near water. This is where you see a great deal of ports like Braavos, Pentos, and Lys. These are by and large fairly similar to what you saw in the Mediterranean, as there were very important ports like Alexandria, Byblos, and others along the Mediterranean coast, some of which had some autonomy, such as those Phoenician city-states. And you also saw influential islands like Cyprus, Crete, and Sicily. Whether or not they were actually independent for that long is a story for another time. Now, due to its proximity and history to this area of Essos, the area of the Free Cities is highly interwoven with that of Westeros. For one, if you trace back the lineage of the people from Westeros, they actually came from Essos. The first men crossed a land bridge between Dorne and Essos, in a similar manner that the ancestors of the Native Americans crossed a land bridge between what is now Siberia and Alaska. In George R. R. Martin's fictional world, as time went on, as technology advanced, another ethnic group called the Andals would invade by sea. The Andals make up the dominant ethnic group not only in Westeros today, but many of the northern regions of the Free City areas, namely the city of Braavos. Braavos is a major banking center on top of that. It even has a monument that is quite indicative of the Colossus of Rhodes. It's a major maritime port, and it also has banned slavery, in sharp contrast to many other free cities. The reason for this probably stems from the fact that the Andals were people fleeing many of the slave captors from the Valyrian freehold, which was a massive empire that I'm going to discuss shortly. These Andals would eventually form the Religion of the Seven, which again banned slavery. After all, it made sense for a people fleeing slavers to be against slavery. And these people would set up cities that would be opposed to slavery and eventually migrate and conquer territory in Westeros in which slavery would eventually be banned as well. Braavos' influence has not simply been through its social policies or its religion, but also through finance, namely through the Bank of Braavos, which in many ways could be seen as fairly analogous to the banks of Florence, which became major financial centers during early modern European history. I suppose you could argue that the Bank of Braavos operates similarly to the Medici family of Florence. Moving on to other free cities, many of them are just not quite as interesting as Braavos, to be honest. Many of them sell slaves, but other ones don't have slaves. Again, they're independent, so they can pick or choose what policies they want. And furthermore, the only major distinction that is referenced in many of the books by and large happens to deal with what exports they have. For example, some may sell perfume, others may sell dyes, others herbs and spices. So let's move on to the Valyrian Freehold, which is the southern peninsula that juts out into the ocean with a handful of islands. This area is highly volcanic and is the home of the dragons that were tamed by, well, the Valyrians. The Valyrians were by and large analogous to the Roman Empire, a great empire that through innovation, institutions, and military prowess, in the case of Valyrians, along with some dragons, managed to conquer a vast territory of land, basically forming a bunch of mini civilizations in the process. The reason being is that they had power and influence and infrastructure to spread their quote-unquote civilized ways to many of the hunter-gatherer nomadic peoples in the region. Many of the free cities I mentioned previously actually started out as Valyrian ports and forts. This is similar in a way that the cities like London, once Londinium under the Roman Empire, started out as a Roman fortress. And there are many cities today in Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East that started off as major centers or perhaps local centers of the Roman Empire. One exception to this would be the aforementioned Braavos, which again was founded by slaves who rebelled against the Valyrians. This could be seen similar to, say, the Spartacus rebellion in Roman history, when Spartacus, a man from what is now Romania, rebelled against the Roman Empire as he was a slave. However, Spartacus probably was not looking to ban slavery throughout the Roman Empire, and it was probably just a matter of personal affairs. Another key inspiration from history, specifically with Valyria, would be its former rivalry with the Empire of Old Ghiz. Ghiz was another empire that controlled much of Essos and the surrounding islands, and they are quite analogous to the Phoenician city-state of Carthage. There were a group of Phoenicians from the city-state of Tyre who had moved to what is now Tunisia to set up the city-state of Carthage, which would eventually outlive the independent state of Tyre and produce quite an impressive empire themselves, with a vibrant maritime culture, setting up colonies around much of the Mediterranean. This city would eventually become incredibly prosperous, mixing Phoenician and Berber culture together, and was quite large and formidable, similar to the old empire of Ghiz. However, Carthage was locked into a war with the Roman Republic, and after a few of these quote-unquote Punic Wars, Punic meaning Phoenician, the Romans won. They burned down Carthage and supposedly, according to legend, put salt in the earth to prevent the soil from growing. And while that probably wasn't true, they did indeed end the power play of Carthage, and Carthage by and large just became another Roman port. Romans needed to acquire the lands of Carthage to produce prosperous agriculture, and if anything, while Carthage was no longer a political entity, many of the customs and cultures were kept intact and used to fuel the Roman Empire as a whole. It was not really simply one of conquest and destruction, but rather conquest, destruction, and then incorporation. And in many ways, the same has happened in George R. R. Martin's fictional world. The Valyrian freehold eventually destroyed the old empire of Ghiz. This was the battle between the dragon and the harpy, and much of Ghiz was eventually incorporated into the Valyrian freehold with some of the remaining culture intact. Today, remnants of the Empire of Ghiz are known as Slavers' Bay, a collection of slave-owning city-states that are, let's just say, not renowned for their human rights track records. I suppose this could be seen as roughly analogous to certain maritime empires of the Muslim world, which continued to practice slavery long after other parts of the world would have banned it. During the early modern period, you saw the rise of the Barbary states along North Africa. These were quite notorious for pirates and slavers. To be clear, this is conjecture. Another area that you see in the original series is the city-state of Qarth, an ancient city that is surrounded by deserts. This area is home to various mystic traditions and is basically the gateway between the east and the west. Sure, it's inhospitable to travel to by land, but by sea it's fairly easy. And I suppose this could be fairly analogous to the way that many saw areas like the Arabian Peninsula, like Mecca and Medina, and what is now Yemen, which were used as gateways to Ethiopia and other parts of the world that were further away from Europe. However, I couldn't really see a very strong inspiration for this one particular city. One area that you do see a great deal of strong historical and geographic inspiration for is the Dothraki Sea. The Dothraki are a nomadic steppe peoples, and they have an equestrian culture, which means that their culture is based off of horses. This is similar to various people groups who lived on the central Eurasian steppes. These people domesticated the horse, and also invented wheeled carts. And through the use of the mobility of their horses and wheeled carts, they managed to invade and subjugate various groups of people. The most early reference to some of these various people groups were the Scythians, which were not a unified state, but rather a collection of various major tribal groups that pillaged on horseback. This was followed by the infamous Huns, who nearly brought the Roman Empire to its knees. And of course, you have the most infamous of all, the Mongols, who formed a gigantic empire, the largest terrestrial empire in human history, oftentimes at the hands of immense bloodshed. The Dothraki, which are again most analogous to the Mongols, eventually conquered wide swaths of land on horseback and pillaged and burned down cities to the ground to collect tribute. In the world of George R. R. Martin, this was called the Century of Blood. The Century of Blood in this fictional world is roughly analogous to the 1100s and 1200s, the time period in which the Mongols sacked and pillaged a gigantic swath of land, followed by several other periods of time in which various other steppe lords would conquer vast swaths of flat land and destroy various cities in their path, subjugating the peoples of what are now China, Iran, and Russia. However, the steppe lords, the horse lords if you could call them that, did not have a particularly good long shot, and eventually, due to their lack of administration and logistics, they broke off into various clans and were far weaker. On top of that, with more technological output from civilized people, if you could call them that, they managed to then subjugate these steppe peoples. And to some extent, this has already happened to the Dothraki. In the time period of the Game of Thrones, the Dothraki are by and large past their prime. No longer a collective whole, but rather a fractured group of warring tribesmen. Now, as you move further east, you get the region of Asshai. This place is the origin of the Red Woman, also known as Melisandre, in the original Game of Thrones series. However, we really know very little about this area. We don't even know how the people look like in this region because Melisandre, by and large, is a witch who could change her appearance. Overall, given the fact that they're so far away from Westeros, I doubt they would look particularly Caucasian like the Red Woman. Nonetheless, while we know very little about this region, we do know that there have been some remnants of dragons here, and most importantly, it is the foundation of the religion of the Red God. The religion of the Red God is most analogous to the religion of Zoroastrianism in our world. It is one of the oldest religions in the world and has had a massive impact on influencing Abrahamic religions like Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. This religion was found in what is now Iran and is based off of a binary between good versus evil, whereby the good god will one day triumph over the evil god. In many ways, this has influenced other religions, namely the attribution of the devil or Satan into Christianity or Shaitan into Islam, a binary between the good God or Allah and the evil Satan or Shaitan, the red god and the, I suppose, god of ice that you see in Game of Thrones. The religion of Zoroastrianism has influenced many other pop culture entities, such as Star Wars, which is a battle between good versus evil, as well as Freddie Mercury's music from Queen, as he was a Parsi, an ethnic group of Zoroastrians from India. As you move even further east, you get lands that are just totally shrouded in mystery, conjecture, and, well, straight up bullshit. One region of Essos that is referenced but never visited in the show is the Golden Empire of Yiti, which is said to have been more powerful than that of Valyria at its prime. This area, if you could call it that, is one that we again know almost nothing about, but seems to be inspired by China. It is on the shores of the Jade Sea. Jade is oftentimes associated with Chinese culture. Explorers have mentioned tales of emperors, tigers, pottery, and silk, which are quite reminiscent of the tales Europeans heard and told about China. HBO is currently in the midst of potentially creating an animated offshoot series about the Golden Empire of Yiti. It's quite interesting to see the parallels between this because medieval Europeans knew very little about China before Marco Polo, and perhaps they can incorporate this sort of narrative into the storyline in the new series. Now, outside of Essos, there are also a number of other regions that are tangentially talked about, such as the Summer Isles, where Grey Worm is from, at least in the actual TV show, not necessarily in the books. This area seems to have people that by and large look African. Tyrion in the show also mentions that they have a fertility goddess that has 16 teats, which is kind of hot and disturbing at the same time. There's also a continent called Sothorios, or Sothoros, which I don't really know how to pronounce, but I'm assuming it's called that because it's, well, south. This region is described as being analogous to medieval Africa, but even more distant and even more mysterious. In our world, medieval Europeans, at least the educated ones, had a fairly decent understanding of North Africa, and even perhaps Ethiopia, which was predominantly Christian and is still to this day. However, they knew virtually nothing about Africa south of the Sahara outside of Ethiopia. Before the 1800s, Europeans knew quite a lot about Northern Africa, as there were so many trade relations, but the vastness of the Sahara cut them off from much of sub-Saharan Africa. In Sothorios, the top part of the continent is filled with dense jungle, which is very inhospitable and hard to traverse. As a result of this, exploration is quite difficult for the Westerosi, or even people from Essos for that matter, as you have to traverse not only through dense jungle terrain, but also with a bunch of diseases that exist in this region due to mosquitoes. There are a large number of quote-unquote lost cities in Sothorios that I think are quite analogous to the lost cities of the Amazon rainforest in South America that we know almost nothing about. Outside of that, we only know about a handful of a few other islands, like the island of Noth, home to the pacifistic people, who do not engage in war but unfortunately are preyed upon by slavers. There's also the Basilisk Isle, which is basically a hub of pirates and slavers. There's also an area on the map called Ulthos, which we know nothing about whatsoever, other than it looks like it's forested according to the map. And I kind of like the fact that we know nothing about it, because it helps us empathize with people in the past who looked at maps at their time, not knowing much about the world beyond that which was close to them. Keep in mind that many maps from ancient China and Korea also portray this sort of attitude, but in reverse. oftentimes emphasizing what they know and making up tall tales about faraway places. And I suppose the fictional people of Yiti or Asshai far away from Westeros probably have tall tales of Westeros. While it's easy to scoff at people in the past making up stories and bullshitting themselves about places they've never been to, it's worth pointing out that all of this is testament to humanity's incredible imagination. Thanks for watching.